I'd like to see him come home and everyone would be crying out for the George Groves fight. It's an even match. There's a lot of rivalry, a lot of history. He wants to fight Chudinov, but he's getting peanuts for that fight. He would get big money to fight James Degale, but he's probably thinking if he wins the WBA title, he'll get parity money with Degale. I think it would appeal to everyone though. Callum Smith is knocking on the door. He would have been the mandatory if James had won the WBC belt. I don't think the Eubank Jr. fight will ever happen. One, I don't think he's good enough. Two, he's got his dad in his ear hole talking absolute garbage. He had one fight against a person with a good record, that was Billy Joe Saunders, and he got skinned. He's going for a world title with the IBO. It's a joke. Then you come and say you want a unification fight. What? I'd much rather James fight Groves or Smith. Eubank is not a Darrell or a Badu Jack. I think he's more of a middleweight anyway. Whose category is his mandatory and they are very strict. You have to look at risk reward. So it will be interesting to see how it all pans out. He's a tough opponent and you don't get paid much for that, but we'll see how Eddie Hearn and Al Heyman can work out the business decisions. I think Smith versus Anthony Darrell is a 50-50 fight. If it's in the UK, I might lean towards Smith. In America, I'd lean towards Darrell. You're dealing with a proven against someone who has to prove. But Smith is a very good fighter. Home advantage would be massive. Smith is a class fighter, but he is untested. I think he'd admit that himself. But he comes from a great boxing family, and if he pulls it off, it would be massive against Degale. Those are the words of Jim Mcdonnell, the trainer of IBF super middleweight world champion James Degale, talking about a potential fight, or I guess an impossible fight the way Jim McDonnell's talking, a fantasy fight between James Degale and Chris Eubank Jr., and also talking about the Callum Smith possible fight, the George Groves possible fight, and how he sees Callum Smith doing against Anthony Darrell. I'd like to hear your views on all of those things that Jim McDonnell mentioned, but particularly the Eubank Jr. situation. He says he don't think the fight will ever happen because A, Eubank Jr. is not good enough. That's a big statement right there, not good enough. Now, I wonder what he means by that. Does he mean that Eubank Jr. will never get into a position where he's actually beaten somebody legitimate and therefore put pressure on James Degale to fight him? Is that what he means? Or, I mean, how else could you really interpret it? I guess he's basically saying Eubank Jr. will never beat a legitimate world level fighter, and therefore why should James Degale fight him? I personally don't think that's true. I think Eubank Jr. will beat legitimate world level fighters. He came close to beating Billy Joe Saunders, who's a current world champion. He didn't beat him, but it was a close fight. Him beating Saunders in a rematch is not inconceivable at all based on what happened in the first fight. So, Jim McDonnell, I don't know, I have to disagree with what you're saying there. And personally, I would like Eubank Jr. versus James Degale. I think that's a great fight. I think it will be exciting. It will be action-packed. It may even be controversial. Chris Eubank Jr. is certainly not as technically good or defensively good or as physically big as a Badu Jack. So I doubt that he'd be able to bully James Degale the way that Badu Jack did. But he's a hell of a lot faster than Badu Jack. He's a spectacular combination puncher. He's got a higher work rate. There are strengths that Eubank Jr. has that surpass the equivalent that Badu Jack possesses in terms of, speed and combination punching ability, movement, even versatility. I think Eubank Jr. is a more versatile fighter. But Badu Jack does the basics but he does them very, very well, to the point where he's extremely effective with them. And he's a big, strong guy. So again, Eubank Jr. versus Degale would be a very different fight than Degale versus Badu Jack in terms of the way the fight plays out, in my view at least, in my estimation. But I don't necessarily think that means it would be a less difficult fight for James Degale. It just might be difficult in a different kind of way. Personally, it's a fight I'd love to see, and I am disappointed to hear Degale and his trainer, Jim Mcdonnell, because Degale's been saying this too, saying that the Eubank Jr. fight will never happen. To me, that's disappointing, because it's a fight I'd really like to see. How do you feel about it in the comment section below? You know, I know people talk about who deserves this and who deserves that. Just from an entertainment standpoint, wouldn't you like to see James Degale and Eubank Jr. in the ring? There was a time when Eubank Jr. and James Degale were both promoted by Mick Hennessy, when James Degale was actually the one who was chasing that fight. And that's when Eubank Jr. was very green indeed. Now Eubank Jr. is a lot more seasoned and he's improved. Why has James Degale done a 360? Him and his team seem to take things very personally. I know that James Degale has the potential to have huge fights, huge money-spinning fights against the likes of George Groves and to a lesser extent Callum Smith. But aside from those two, don't underestimate the earning potential there would be in fighting a Chris Eubank Jr., whether you think he's credible or not. In fact, if you don't think he's credible, if you don't think he's that good, then all the more reason to fight him, because that would be a hell of a lot of money and a hell of a lot of publicity, a very high profile fight against somebody who you think you'll be able to beat easily. I said this a long time ago and I'll reiterate. James Degale's biggest problem is not lack of confidence. He's somebody who in the past I've likened to a Lennox Lewis mentally, in the sense that his problem is actually overconfidence and arrogance, contempt for his opponents. This is why Lennox Lewis lost the 2 fights that he lost, because he was utterly contemptuous of Oliver McCall and Hasim Rahman. Particularly Rahman. He had no respect for that guy at all in the first fight. He thought that was some joke business he was going into there, and he got himself knocked out as a result. You know, some fighters have a very low baseline level of confidence, and they need that confidence constantly boosted. And that confidence level is very fragile. So it's important that they have a team around them who give them confidence, who make them feel comfortable and happy. And then you get other guys like a James Degale, who's the complete opposite. His confidence gets out of control to the point where he thinks he's way better than he actually is. Sometimes he thinks he don't need to train, so on and so forth. He envisages fights being far easier than they actually turn out to be. You know, so could that be the case again if James Degale ever steps in the ring with Chris Eubank Jr.? Could he be going in there thinking Eubank Jr. is rubbish, he's not even that good, and he's got his trainer, Jim Mcdonnell, also telling him that in his ear, he's rubbish, you'll win easy. Isn't that a recipe for disaster if he fights Eubank? Or maybe he's just way too good for Eubank. The Porky Medina fight wasn't a million years ago. Is Eubank Jr. better than Porky Medina? Is he more difficult for James Degale than Porky Medina? I suspect he is. And that Porky Medina fight was very tough for James Degale. Just some food for thought, people. Drop your comments in the comment section below. I'll be very interested to read what you guys have to say about this. All right? It's happening. I'm out.